widely known, so education being a key obligation, by appropriate and active means. I realise a lot of this is very legalistic, but what I really want to convey and what we're eager to convey today is that human rights are legally enforceable, that they are legally binding, and that our governments, successive governments, have committed to these obligations, and that knowledge of these obligations and the way in which we use our knowledge of these obligations can be very important in advocating the kind of issues that we need to advocate on behalf of patients and those accessing services, and indeed those working within services. Two fundamental principles in human rights terms are equality and participation. So non-discrimination and equality, clearly no discrimination in access to healthcare and the underlying determinants of health on any grounds, including mental disability or health status. States must not only prohibit discrimination, but must take positive steps to ensure equality of opportunity for the enjoyment of the right to health. Participation, that persons with mental health difficulties in their respective organisations should be involved throughout the development, implementation and monitoring of legislation, policies, programmes and services that relate to them. When we talk about the concept of indivisibility and interdependence of rights, the right to the highest attainable standard of mental health is not confined to the right to mental health services, but it embraces a wide range of socioeconomic factors that promote conditions in which people can lead a mentally healthy life, and extends to what we describe as underlying determinants of mental health, such as access to work, education or appropriate housing. As you all know, put simply, governments have an obligation not just to provide services, but not to do things that can negatively impact upon the mental health of citizens. So the government must consider, on a cross-departmental, cross-cutting basis, the mental health implications of policy decisions and other decisions. As I said, it's a legal obligation. Article 2 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights says that each state party to the Covenant undertakes to take steps, individually and through international assistance and cooperation, to the maximum of its available resources, with a view to achieving progressively the full realisation of the rights. So we constantly hear government and successive governments, and particularly policymakers, talk about how we can't afford rights. That if we enshrine rights in legislation, for instance, we create a lawyer's charter, that we'll simply allow cowboy lawyers to take advantage of the expression of those rights in law, or that we simply can't afford to put in place those rights. The obligation is not from day one of the expression of those rights in law to immediately deliver the highest standard. It's the highest available standard, and to work to progressively realise that standard, which means that states have an obligation to demonstrate, not just to say, but to demonstrate in practice that conditions continuously improve. So continuous improvement is the key to meeting the obligation. States have an obligation to ensure that measures achieve and do not undermine the spectrum of full human rights by all. That's under the Constitution, under other laws, under policies, budgets and practice. And the state's obligations are to ensure that human rights are effectively enjoyed, and they apply to all branches of the state and to all levels, including local authorities. And the state has an obligation to regulate the behaviour of third parties, corporations, spouses, service providers, trade unions, basically all of us. Government, with an overall responsibility for the highest sustainable standards of health, have to ensure that the environment exists to ensure that that right is realised for all people. Just to draw your attention to some emerging legal issues in relation to health, the adoption of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is meant to show a dawn of a new era in the protection of human rights of persons with mental health difficulties. We hope that that proves to be the case. But certainly the Convention sets out very clearly its purpose is to promote, protect and ensure the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms by all persons with disabilities, and to promote their inherent dignity. And a shift in understanding of disability, of course, from a medical to a social model. Ireland has signed but has not yet ratified the Convention. And importantly, this Convention also has an optional protocol, which means that it provides a means through which individual complaints can be addressed. So if Ireland signs up to this Convention and ratifies the Convention, we certainly hope that, well, it has signed, but if it ratifies the Convention, the individual complaints mechanism hopefully then becomes available, where if those rights are not being respected, there are means through which that can be addressed in the international context. Important in talking about legal obligations, and this really struck me in listening to your General Secretary earlier on, of course, that the obligations extend absolutely to those at the heart of the service, the patient, and the P&A repeatedly speaks about patients as being at the heart of the service, but they also apply, of course, to the rights of those working within the service. And those who work within the service, of course, have a right to a healthy, safe and appropriate environment. So in terms of why Amnesty here in Ireland focused in on mental health particularly, these are statistics and information that you're all too familiar with. 1 in 4 people will experience significant mental health distress at some point in their lives, and suicide levels, particularly among young people, amongst young men, are alarmingly high. Mental health stems from human rights infringements, like the right to an adequate standard of living, education, work, violence against women, etc. So it's indivisibly linked with other human rights issues. And mental health, ill health leads to human rights infringements, such as treatment without informed consent, poor early identification, referral in schools, lack of housing supports, a criminal justice response to perceived offending behaviour, and to further disadvantage vulnerable groups. Public stigma and discrimination are, of course, also a barrier to empowerment and to seeking help. Again, to say some of the things and to highlight some of the things that I know the P&A is only too aware of. Lots of reference to Vision for Change so far in this conference, I'm sure, and we certainly very much look forward and call for the full implementation of all of the recommendations of a Vision for Change. Everybody will be aware that of the community mental health teams committed to under a Vision for Change, of those that are in place, as few as 2 are functioning with a full complement of staff. The Health Research Board showed us that almost a third of residents in psychiatric care in 2007 had been in hospital for more than 5 years, and almost a fifth in hospital between 1 and 5 years. And of course, those high figures are related to an absence of community-based services, including supported housing options. We know that in 2006 the HSE was provided with development funding for child and adolescent mental health teams. It finally identified the development of child and adolescent services as a priority only in 2008, and yet just 50 child and adolescent teams are in place, and where 8 new teams were promised, by the end of 2008 just 3 were delivered. 30% of the almost 3,600 children on waiting list for mental health assessments have been waiting for over a year. And in child and adolescent services, they account for only 5 to 10% of spending on mental health services, while serving almost 23% of the population. So when we talked about principles of non-discrimination, about access, about highest attainable standards, about quality of services, about how resources are used, these are all key human rights issues, and they're the issues that we know you're grappling with as professionals every day. We are of the view that mental health services in Ireland are indeed inadequate, inaccessible and substandard. They are inadequate, uneven in their availability throughout the country, and under-resourced in staff, money and therapies. There is an unnecessarily high use of inpatient treatment and involuntary detention. Mental health services for children, people with intellectual disabilities, homeless people, prisoners and other vulnerable groups are particularly deficient. The ongoing failure to put in place a new forensic psychiatric facility is an indication of how slowly our system can look towards developing new services. Amnesty has been involved for some time with other agencies opposing the siting of the new facility that's, we understand, may be built